And so we've set the foundation from that macro-organizational perspective. We're boring down a little bit, and we're asking some of the healers to come talk about their approach and what they're doing. And as I say, we'll finish off with a mega morning Q&A and see where we get to with regards to the systems and some of the techniques. Rakesh, you've talked on some of those different modalities, and indeed, Juan touched on a lot of things being out there, not all tested. And we'll explore a bit more of that during the course of the day, because at the end of the day, yes, researched and definitive, but yes, results. So gentlemen, I think you've determined the flow. Tim, you're gonna take the last shot, is that right? All right, so Greg Prodaniuk with the OSISS team, I'll let him describe the acronym. Phil Enns with VHA, so provincial health. Oh, by the way, no, they're not military, but they're getting those folks. And clearly, when we were discussing this morning, the larger spectrum of folks with PTSD, VHA mental health, that's their bailiwick. And Tim Black with UVic, associated with Marv Westwood, has been doing research and group therapy for some time, transition program that's got a great reputation, and he'll speak to that piece. So, I don't know, why don't we go left to right?
Okay.
Greg, you're on.
My name is Greg Prodaniuk. I'm the regional coordinator for OSISS. The acronym stands for Operational Stress Injury Social Support. What we do is we have the mandate to establish peer support programs for CF members and veterans and their families. So essentially we do that through sort of one-on-one sort of networking. So it's a sort of direct peer experience and a dialogue on that, as well as through more plural senses of peer support, like social support groups, volunteerism. So again, there's different aspects to how we do that. What we attempt to do is to I guess combat some of the avoidance symptoms that we're talking up there, and depending on where you look at persons that are affected by operational stress injury, and I say affected because we're talking about the family members as well as those that end up with the diagnosis, and those who don't, that are affected by their operational experience. Wherever they are on that timeline of recovery, and you hope the goal for each individual is a return to a quality of life, to move through those life-changing experiences and feel productive again to themselves, their families, and society. But throughout that timeline, there's different ways peer support affects that. So for those that it's the initial sort of stock taking, it's the initial awareness that something has changed in them, and something, of course they generally sense something has changed in them, but the profound nature of how much they have changed and the impacts on their daily lives and routines. So peer support can be effective in reducing some of the barriers, some of the I guess the barriers that stigma, both internal and external, can affect people that are carrying these kinds of things. Also, initially, the family members are usually the first to figure it out, and a lot of times they begin to mimic and take on the behaviors that the person that's suffering. So, peer support can be a very effective tool initially in starting those initial dialogues. I won't say too much more of that. I'll let the panel grow and see how the conversation grows. I would say, so what do we do? What's our core? And I would say for me, it's rooted in my own sort of personal experience. I have PTSD as a result of my experiences in Croatia in 1994. But for me, one of the ways I understand peer support is a lot of the pressure and stress that I put on myself as the injury was beginning to really have large effects on my life. And one of the more profoundly positive moments in that experience was, meeting someone that you may have served with in the past, and having all those kind of social anxieties, and feeling, well, geez, I've changed. Has that person changed? And did I deserve to have the problems I have now? And this was very, very early on when I was beginning to figure out that PTSD was in my life. So the awkward conversations go on, and of course now I'm assuming the other person that's trying to converse with me is judging me, but you're going through that whole sort of a social anxiety portion of that. Next thing you know, we end up downstairs. We're going through a few artifacts. He's showing me some of the things he's collected from a similar mission. And then finally, he kind of goes over to this shelf. I always remember this metal shelf in his basement, and on it he had some cinder blocks sort of holding the shelf up. And he kind of pushed aside the cinder blocks, and he said, this is what they got me on. And that's where he was keeping his pills. And his pills weren't upstairs in his medical cabinet. They were downstairs hidden behind the cinder blocks. And he says, what do they have you on? So the conversation that came all after that point about living with it, about having that want to get better, having to want to return to a quality of life, that was a very positive experience. And that empowered me to engage with my clinicians in a different way, engage with my family in a different way, even gingerly reach out and touch and talk with the people that had served with me or the people that were from my work family. So peer support in the initial stages of how I was beginning to recover was a big piece, that kind of positive exposure. Now, peer support can be intrinsic, and there's peer support in all subunits within the military and within small towns. So OSISS doesn't own peer support. There's bad peer support, and there's good peer support. And I think and there's sort of medium peer support. So one of the things that OSISS strives to do, is we try to lean towards that good kind of peer support and the positive elements of that discussion and that relationship that built between me and another veteran in his basement. How do we duplicate that? How does that sort of roll forward? We do introductions.
Well, thanks. I'm just recovering from a bit of a respiratory thing, so hopefully I'm not going to hack my way through this. Just wanted to say how profoundly affected and impressed I have been with the presentations already this morning. Some of those scenes were, very vivid and evocative of, experiences. Certainly, we don't deal so much with the military. I'm here representing the community more, but still, nonetheless, clients who have experienced many traumatic events. So I'm with the Vancouver Island Health Authority. Specifically, I'm with the Urgent Short-Term Assessment and Treatment Clinic. And we're a clinic of about 10 full-time therapists, 7 part-time therapists, and a 7 part-time psychiatrist. And we provide the frontline treatment of people in the CRD who are suffering from a variety of mental health symptoms. So we don't have anything specific for PTSD, and yet many of our clients come in with some post-traumatic stress symptoms. I would say the bread and butter of what we do is dealing with major depression, anxiety, and people adjusting to very difficult circumstances. I'd say it's fairly rare that we would get pure PTSD, and I think has been alluded to in earlier presentations, is that the presentation is usually complex and mixed with anxiety, depression, sleep disturbance, etc. We are provincially funded, but we are local to the region of the CRD. And of course, there's never enough funding for all the problems that are out there. So there is a necessary tendency, I guess, in health in general and in mental health in particular, that we have to ration services somewhat. So we have kind of an arbitrary cap on the number of sessions people get, which doesn't work really well with PTSD. So an average of 8 to 12 sessions is what we do in individual therapy. People also have an option to go into some group therapy programs. We have cognitive behavioral therapy groups. Again, they're mostly targeting depression, anxiety, and we have what we call a mind-body group, which focuses on meditation and yoga. We have also something called an emotion regulation group for people who are having trouble controlling extreme emotions. We also have a more intensive program specifically for the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And often these people have experienced early childhood trauma. And it's based on, some of you may be familiar with dialectical behavior therapy. It's a very intense program, hard to get in, limited resources, but if you do get in, it's the Cadillac. You get a year of weekly psychotherapy, individual psychotherapy, as well as a weekly group. And so the commitment level has to be quite high in order for a person to get into that, as well as there has to have been sort of multiple treatment failures before they could really be eligible for that. The front door to all of mental health services is the mental health intake. So nobody just knocks on our door and begins to get service. They have to go through their family doctor. And we understand that that sometimes is a barrier for people, and yet the family doctors in the community really are, in a sense, the ultimate front line and see most of the people who have mental health issues in our community. So you really do need to have a physician referral. Then the mental health intake, they do their own triage, and they can refer to our program, the USTAT program. General psychiatry is another program which has case managers and psychiatrists to see people with what we would call serious and persistent mental illness, more looking at, things like schizophrenia, difficult to control bipolar illness, and severe depression. There is also a mood disorders clinic that focuses more specifically on bipolar disorder and severe depression. There's an anxiety clinic, and normally, if we look at the DSM categorization of mental health issues, PTSD would fit under an anxiety clinic, but they also have limited resources, and so the main focus there is probably social anxiety. So you can see that there's nothing specifically targeting PTSD, and yet I would have to say, in my conceptualization of treating PTSD, I think that you can look at a collaborative stage model, stage one being establishing a therapeutic relationship and creating a sense of safety and a sense of trust in the whole therapeutic process. And for some people, that is the essence of therapy, and that can also be, acquiring skills to manage emotions and that sort of thing. There is, of course, some people who need to go into the story. That would be more into the stage two of PTSD treatment. So that is more than what generally we can do. Sometimes we get into that to some degree, but often that's where we have to partnership with other agencies in the community. For instance, if it's a woman who suffered sexual assault or rape or childhood sexual abuse, they could go to the Women's Sexual Assault Center. That's a funded agency, and they can get various levels of treatment and support and longer term than what we're able to provide. There's also a men's trauma center. Now, they are not as funded as the Women's Sexual Assault Center, but they have a sliding fee scale. If you were a victim of assault, Victim Services may fund part of your treatment. And so there's a variety of ways that you can piece together a more comprehensive PTSD treatment, but it's not going to all be generally in one place. And then I think, the third phase of treatment is the consolidation phase, where hopefully you're sitting with someone who has a good understanding of PTSD and helps understand what you've come through and what kinds of changes you've made. And again, it may be different people along the journey. If you're lucky enough to have an employer-sponsored health plan, you might have a private therapist. The other options in the community are private psychiatrists. Very difficult to get in, long wait lists, but they are there, and can be appropriate and accessed sometimes. And so, yeah, I guess that's most of what I think I need to say for now. But anyway, that's the story from the community.
Sure, that's not the whole story. Hi, my name's Tim Black, and the agenda says Marv Westwood, and if you've ever met Marv, you know that we don't even look alike, so it's a little bit confusing if I'm up here, but Marv is actually delivering supervision for the Veterans Transition Program on the East Coast. I'm going to talk about the Veterans Transition Program, a little bit of the history. I just want to check with Roger, though, when are we stopping this particular panel? Because people are going to get hungry.
I'm going to take, including the Q&A, till 12:15, so you've got plenty of time, Tim.
Okay, I have a whole formal presentation prepared, but I get the sense this will be a little bit more sort of conversational. Personally, I've been working with veterans and transitioning members for about 14 years. Back in '98, we ran our first Veterans Transition Program, actually here on the island. I was at UBC in Vancouver doing my graduate work. And it's changed a lot over the years. Basically, the current version right now, which is what I would have presented sort of in a more formal capacity, has been fully funded by the Royal Canadian Legion, and I look out and see some of my Legion
Tim, let me interrupt. Which one of the three do you want up? We've got the time for it.
Okay. It's, I don't know.
Veterans Transition Program?
That would be the one.
Okay.
My apologies in advance. You're going to get sick of seeing me because I have another afternoon panel and then I'm closing the day, so I wasn't supposed to be up here this many times, but okay.
That look familiar for you?
That's great. Yeah, thanks.
You have a mouse over there?
I do. Can I just advance it by clicking? Okay.
Should be left click, and if it doesn't, I'll play the game over here.
So as you can see, my name's at the top, not because I'm the most important, just because I'm the person presenting this today. Marv Westwood's really the person who got this all rolling, and he's who I've been working with for the last 14 years. It's really a team effort. Duncan Shields, David Kuhl, myself, Tim Laidler. We're all part of a team that's been working on this for years and years, trying to refine it, trying to move it forward. And this is actually a presentation that we gave to the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs. They actually flew them out from Ottawa to meet with us at UBC because there was a lot of interest in sort of, what are you guys doing? You've been doing it for a long time now. It's, you know, it seems to be getting pretty positive responses. So what are you doing? So we said, well, here's what we're doing. The program itself is a structured program, and as said, for some people who may have been a part of this in the early days, it's actually quite different. It's a lot more involved now than it used to be. Essentially, it's a 10-day program where we do 4 days on, we take a month off, then we do 4 days on again, take a couple weeks off, and then we do 2 days on, and they're residential. The really important thing about this, and why I want to stress the funding for this coming from the Legion, is that this is free to participants. So they don't pay a penny. Their travel, their ferries will fly people sometimes from out of province if they're ready for it. It costs them nothing, and it comes from the Legion's Poppy Fund primarily, and from the Legion Foundation. So, you know, Remembrance Day, when you see the people with the poppies and you wonder, well, what do they do with that money? Well, this is part of what they do with that money, is actually fund this so that the people coming in don't have to pay a dime for what they're experiencing. So in terms of barriers to access, it takes away some of those barriers that people have talked about. It's about 100 hours of contact. We do about 6 to 8 people in the group per, and then we do follow-up. So there's usually an intake, you know, as you'll know as we get through talking a lot about this, not everything is for everybody. Right? Sometimes you're just not ready to be in a group. It's kind of, it can be intense. So sometimes people are better off just being with an individual therapist, hooking up with OSISS. I see my friend Phil's out here from OSISS. You know, I refer people to VHA. It's sort of a complementary part of what's going on here. It has to be right for the person at the time they're ready to do it. Because it is fairly intense, if you're not ready for it, it can be like anything else. It's better off not going until you're ready. So that's the sort of general overview. One of the things that's unique about this is that we do have our professional facilitators. So I've been doing this for about 14 years. We do bring our graduate students because I'm teaching at UVic, Marv Westwood's at UBC, and there's a lot of students that we really feel it's important as part of the community preparation. One of the barriers identified by a lot of the people over the years is that they go to see some therapist who has no idea about the military, has no idea about their background, and they get so turned off they just disappear. And they'll never come back again. Like they won't. And sometimes the first time coming back is that sort of tentative, well, do I really want to do this? So we take seriously the idea of training counselors to understand about the military context, the veteran culture, those kinds of things. For the therapists out there who get it, you'll always have people coming to you. Their friends will refer them to you. They say, "Oh yeah, this guy's good. He's checked out," that kind of thing. But one of the really unique things about this, it is a transition program. It's not focused primarily and only on PTSD, although a large portion of the people coming into the program do have PTSD. We actually have people who graduated the program, so they go through their 10 days. They get trained now at UBC with 4 credit in continuing studies courses to learn how to be what are called paraprofessional helpers. And they come back into the group, and they act as liaison between someone like myself, who I'm not military, I have my own background, and the people that are coming into the program. They talk about their experience. They say, they're going to ask you to do this stuff. It seemed kind of kooky. I thought it was weird, but, give it a shot. I tried it. It didn't turn out too bad for me. So, give it a shot. It's actually, they don't actually care if we think it is helpful. But when the peer helpers say, look, I did it, and yes, it's weird, and yes, it works, then people say, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll give it a shot. So what we're trying to do is rolling in this notion of part of the transition problems for people coming out of the military is that they're underemployed or unemployed, they're having problems getting training. Usually say, like, what are the transferable skills for a C9 gunner? There are them, they actually do exist, but how do you articulate them? And if that's what you've been doing for the last 6 months, where are you going to find work? You might get sniper work with the police force, but even then, there's not that much, right? And people do. I mean, people do actually get work doing that. So we try to roll that into the program and say, well, you can get some work experience. You can start building your CV, coming in and working with us under supervision, and then we provide references for the soldiers heading off into work jobs and doing other things in their career. So the goals of the program, I'll just put these up here. You can see here that it isn't a PTSD treatment program directly, because PTSD actually, I don't know if people are aware, but PTSD is a funny thing. You either have it or you don't clinically. And there's a continuum, talk about subsyndromal PTSD, but the fact of the matter is that two people can have PTSD and have an incredibly different experience. People with complex developmental PTSD versus simple, quote unquote, PTSD of like a single adult event, they both have PTSD. And oftentimes, in order to not have PTSD, you just get rid of the avoidance and numbing symptom. So the reoccurring nightmares, the flashbacks are there, the hypervigilance, the startle response. Shalev's research back in the day, I think it was 2000, said that's part of the problem of measuring treatments according to PTSD, is that once you drop one of the symptom clusters, you can technically not have PTSD. So you're better. But it actually doesn't work that way. There's a huge continuum. I hope it'll be addressed in the DSM-5. Rakesh talked a lot about that. There's a lot of growth and change with this, but it's one of the major problems with tracking what works with PTSD. Because once you drop that one symptom cluster, you don't have it, so you show up as healed. But that's just one of the things, and it can be quite complex. So we have really, it's soldiers helping soldiers. We have professional facilitators. I've been a group therapist for, again, about 14 years working with this stuff. But our expertise is in trying to help soldiers help each other, because, as they'll always say, people who haven't been there can't help. Unless you know what I've been through, unless you've been there, unless you've worn the uniform, unless you've been there, you actually can't help. Only people who've been there. So that's what we try to facilitate, is a process of soldiers helping each other get through this stuff. We talk about dropping baggage. People drop baggage from their tours. They drop baggage from just peacetime service. They drop baggage from their childhood. One of the things that we have to bear in mind, and I'll talk a bit about in the afternoon, is trauma is cumulative. So not everything that happens once you put the uniform on. Actually, there's a lot of stuff that happens sometimes when you're a child and onwards. And that stuff just builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. Further to Rakesh's point about both people, it's like, well, we were both there and nothing happened to me. It's like, well, yeah, but there's two very different people. We try to actually help them, and we teach them communication skills. And the great thing about working with soldiers and people from the CF is that they're so trainable that we just say, here, try this. And they go, okay. And they go and do it. You should see, working with civilians, it's a nightmare. It's like, try this. Well, I don't know. I mean, I kind of do it my way, and this is sort of how I would do it. It's like, can you just do it, please? Like, just try it. And with the military folks, like, okay, we're going to do this. Can you just give that a shot? Okay. And they do. It's like, well, great. Okay. Well, how about this? Okay, we can do that too. And they pick up a lot of the skills, and the transferability. Talking about the families, they go home and they're supposed to try it out. Just basic active listening. Don't react. Don't just respond. Try to check to see if you actually understood what your partner was saying. When your boss, tore a strip off you, before you tear a strip back or throw a garbage can, check to see, hey, did you actually hear what you thought you heard? And of course, if you did hear him tear a strip off you and it wasn't fair, then you can throw the garbage can. But if you check it out and you realize, oh no, I misheard you. So many of the problems that people experience with this has to do with sometimes the communication skills. So we teach them that and people try it and they report back that it's very helpful. And then we also talk about coming up and out of the program. So we're talking about member strengths coming in, goal setting, et cetera, et cetera. So the program trajectory, this is just sort of how we metaphorically put it out there. We basically create a place for people to come in, a safe zone, create the team. So it's really about building this. And again, I work with civilians and military. So as a group therapist, like a dream come true working with military people, because they're so comfortable in groups. You just start it and all of a sudden the group cohesion's there. It's like magic. Trying to do it with civilians is like herding cats. Like, you know, it could take 15 weeks to get the kind of cohesion we can get in a weekend with folks in the military. Not always.
Do you trade clients?
Sure, yeah, anytime. It's a pleasure, actually, you can see. We get into doing the work, and I'll explain a little bit more about that, consolidating people's strengths and sort of re-equipping for where they're going up and out. So the idea is transition, right? So there's people who are transitioning out currently, there's people who have been out for 20 years, and they're still trying to make that transition. That's a lot of my research that I do. And then moving right out is strategic goal setting. It's kind of good timing for this because I'm actually right in the middle of, we just finished phase 1. I'm delivering it locally out at Brentwood Bay, again with the funding from the Legion. There's no conference centers here that aren't like 4-star resorts. So it's really a burden to have to deliver it at Brentwood Bay, and all the guys feel it because it's just so roughing it. I mean, it's like nobody likes it. It's not true, actually. It's like this deluxe version. We're all kind of pinching ourselves, doing like, what are we actually doing here? You know, but it's the only place that is available. So we've done the first four days residential. We're in the middle of our month break now. And so we're doing follow-up. I send an email to the group every week. My partner and I trade off, calling half the group one week, half the group the next week, constantly in conversation. And then they're actually tasked to call each other. It's a buddy chain. So this person has to call this person at least once a week. The next person calls the next person all the way around. So everybody's making a call and receiving a call every week for the 4 weeks in between the four days. And they do it anyways. They get together for coffee. They connect, that kind of thing. The program features, some of the things that we see is sort of, because it's a complementary type of service to all the things that we're hearing about today, and I know Athel's going to talk about his thing, Karen's going to talk about her thing. There's lots of great stuff out there that works, and this is really just another thing that people can try. But really what we do is that there's no formal diagnosis required, so you don't have to go through and get into the system of having, you know, the official PTSD diagnosis. When we do the screening, though, we do ask people, do you want to? Because some people are not currently Veteran Affairs clients, and maybe they can access services continuing on from this. If they want to, we can help refer, we can get them set up, get them into the system if they choose, but it's not required. It's a pretty heterogeneous group. So the current group we've got people from multiple eras. We've got people from Afghanistan and people who served, you know, years and years and years ago. And it actually makes for a good mix because they all share some of the similar things, but from different perspectives. Again, we have our graduate military paraprofessionals, and it's fully funded. So in terms of taking down the barriers to access, one of the things about the program that is unique, if you're a clinician working with people who have PTSD, especially men, because men are notoriously bad for going for help, we have about a 98% completion rate. I think we've had 1 or 2 people not finish the program, and I think of those people, they were sort of personal circumstances that had very little to do with what was going on. They just very serious things that they had to deal with. If you think about that in terms of trying to keep people in treatment, and again, it's not because we're that great. It's because we build the group so that they feel connected to one another and they feel supported by one another, but also they feel responsible for helping each other. They do feel that camaraderie of saying, look, if that guy needs help, I'm sticking, because even if I don't really want to do my stuff, I know he wants to do his stuff, and if I leave, I'm going to let him down. So there's a lot of that going on as well. This is just sort of the numbers, again, for the government standing committee. They wanted to see, well, what are your numbers? This is just looking at a decrease in depression. You can see the total on the left-hand side. So the depression scores come down after the program's over. Those are just pre and post tests for each of the VTP groups that we had data on. I feel a little bit self-conscious presenting this because it's not data. I didn't do the studies. So if you have questions, I'll give you Marv's email address. But you can see for those of the statisticians in the group, the significance values are pretty high. We'd always talk about, okay, it's a change, but does it really matter? So yes, statistically significantly speaking, yes, they are significant. Clinically significant, clinical significance and statistical significance are different things. So we see clinical improvement. This is the statistical side of things. Second, looking at some of the trauma symptoms. So that was depression. This is a trauma symptom inventory, which is a pretty established test. So looking at again, just the decreases. And in terms of effect sizes for the people who are interested in stats in the room, looking at small, medium, and large effect sizes on the different subscales. So you can see one of the things that the large effect size here on this side, anger and irritability, Rakesh talked about that, other people talked about that part of the problem is that people burst into these sort of angry outbursts. And that's one of the things that starts to decrease as people get into talking about those things. So again, some of the data there. This one was an interesting one. This is a self-esteem rating scale. And you'll notice that there's actually one group here where self-esteem dropped. I'm not entirely sure what that's showing. It's a relatively small number of people in that group. Overall, for all the VTP groups, you can see self-esteem increases. Part of this could be part of when the testing happens, particular trajectories of people's treatment. Oftentimes in trauma, people get a lot worse before they get better. They start to feel crummier in the middle of it, and then they start to come out of it. So it's hard to say. I can't say a lot about what exactly was going on with that group, but it's there. Now this will blow your mind. This is basically the schedule for the first weekend. So the 4 days that we just completed, this is what we did over the course of the weekend. Just to orient you to the diagram, the green are basically in-group sessions where people are working on their stuff. We have exercises that they do. The yellow parts are parts where we're doing a lot of pairs work. So we send them off into pairs, talk about it. One of the ways we start the group off is we say, go off in pairs, you got about 20 minutes, and I want you to listen to each other's proudest moment in the military. And people say, well, that's kind of counterintuitive. Aren't they supposed to be there to talk about the crap? Well, yes, but as a trauma therapist, if you don't talk about the positive stuff and you don't resource people, all it does is basically drive people down. It's actually really easy to get people to talk about trauma. And when I teach my students, it's not a problem. Just ask a couple questions. You can plunge people deep into their trauma way sooner than they're ready for it. That's no problem. This doesn't take a lot of skill. The skill is how you do it. That over-arousal, under-arousal thing that Rakesh put up, the 2 pictures of the brain, Pat Ogden's work is about, there's this thing called a therapeutic window. If you're too agitated and you keep doing the work, it's not going to help. If you're not agitated enough and you keep doing the work, it's not going to help. You have to be inside that therapeutic window. So we have to balance out the trauma, the negative stuff with things like that. And the feeling in the group, when they talk about their proudest moment, is palpable. And they connect and they talk about that. And we keep going back to those resource times. I won't go through all this, but you can basically see this here is individual work where they're on their own in the evenings writing things up. The 2 main things for the first weekend are 2 structured life review exercises. One is your major branching points. So significant things that you went through that shaped who you are and how you got here. And they do it on their own. They write 2 pages, they come back, and there's a structured way of going through that. The second one is looking at your experience of traumatic events. And there's only 2 pages, which is intentional to limit what people actually get into, but they just choose which one they want to speak to the group. So there's choice, they choose what they write, they choose what they speak to, and then they get feedback. Again, the support, when a soldier listens to another soldier, and there's Navy people in Air Force, they use soldiers sort of maybe inappropriately, so no offense intended to the other branches of the military here. When the soldiers respond to each other after listening to their stories, they say, you know, when you talked about what happened to you on tour on Road 05, right, I was there. I remember that. I remember what happened that day. And I wasn't a part of what exactly you went through, but I remember what you're talking about. And hearing that you had to deal with that stuff in addition to what all happened that day, I can see why you'd be bothered by that. Those things alone, every single time someone talks about that and they get that validation from people who've actually been there, it heals a lot of that isolation, sometimes the shame, sometimes the confusion. And again, it's not us. You know, we make our comments too. We try to be therapeutic and helpful, and sometimes we are. Sometimes maybe we aren't, probably we aren't. But all of it's structured, a lot of choice, and then they finish the weekend. So 7 people have finished this one. We're in our middle time now. the next piece that we go on to, again, is what's called therapeutic enactment. You can see we get a lot more into actually doing the work. Again, these are moments that people choose to work through action. One of the things for dealing with men and trauma is that if you have a partner, sometimes getting them to sit down across from you and have the intense conversation, right, about your emotions, it's not going to happen, right? And so we don't do that. We don't do that a lot. We actually get people getting up. Don't tell us what happened. Show us what happened. So we actually recreate scenes that people choose beforehand. We plan it out. It's not spontaneous. We're not just flying by the seat of our pants. We're very, very carefully planning what they're going to do. And there's usually an injury point, right? As you say, there's 8 months of a tour and all these different things. What oftentimes has happened is people will choose one they need to do now. It's a memory that's coming to them now. It's just the thing that for right now, it's just bugging me. I can't get over it. So they choose those things. And we use action methods to go through that using therapeutic enactment. Part of the video, if anybody has seen the documentary War in the Mind, was anybody here for the public showing of that at UVic? So several people. If you haven't seen it, you can find it online. TVO has it. It's done by Judy Jackson out of Salt Spring. Really cool film looking at a lot of different things across the issues of military. The whole movie is online, and you can see there's a little 10-minute segment that features the Veterans Transition Program. And then the last phase really is up and out. So, we're looking at finishing up the work we're doing, and then we're looking at where are you going from here, and that's the big thing about transition. What are you doing after this? How are you going to take what you've learned here? Oftentimes what they take is the connection with the other men in the group. I say men, we have had some mixed gender groups, but we've decided to do them sort of single gender. We're in the process now of actually trying to get enough people to run a women's veterans transition program. If you know anybody who's interested, just let me know. We've been trying, so tblack@uvic.ca. So yeah, I'll just finish this piece off, and then I know Roger wants to do this, so that's it. That was good timing. So I'll turn it over to Roger before I get into answering questions, because I know he's got to keep time here. But
thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. So, folks, we've gone from the national and the systems and the definitions, and now to the tactical. So we're going to have a tactical Q&A. So I'll ask Juan and Rakesh, why don't you come on up? We'll sit you down, and we've got half an hour. If it takes the whole half hour, that's great. And if we peter out, we'll just get off to lunch. I'll point out that I've got, by last count, about 60 people online, including about 10 folks at William Head. So you're being watched by William Head. Be careful. If you want to swear, do it in Swahili, please. And so we'll turn to Q&A for about a half hour, and it basically encapsulates the whole morning of event. You gents have a microphone. I've got one for questioners. And it's basically the system, the treatment. What do you want to know?
Dr. Black, I'm Alan Waddy, I'm loud enough.
No, I got to get you on.
Thank you. Alan Waddy, I'm one of 2 Legion Command Service officers. The other Command Service officers here. I've met you before. I'm very supportive of the Veterans Transition Program. I refer clients to the program. However, I have a very small niggly, and you kind of touched on it. I'm a Royal Canadian Navy veteran, served all over the world with the Canadian Forces, with the Army, with the Air Force, and I'm a PTSD survivor. When I see soldier there, it turns me off. And I'm wondering if there's somehow that maybe you can address this. Because we're not all soldiers.
no, absolutely.
Thank you.
That's, yeah, and that's why I said that. The truth of the matter is that the vast majority of people who come through have been infantry, that kind of thing. So they have actually been from the Army. So it's kind of an unfortunate leftover from how things started. And once something starts to gain momentum, unfortunately, it gains a momentum of itself. So I try to speak to it when I speak to it, because I'm sensitive to that notion that not everybody out there is a soldier, and a person who serves in the Navy doesn't consider themselves necessarily a soldier. So we try to use terms like Canadian Forces members, veterans. We use the Legion definition of a veteran, which is anybody who's served. That's all it takes for us. If you've put the uniform on, as far as the Veterans Transition Program is concerned, you're a veteran. And that was adopted in Prince George back in whatever. So, yeah, so my apologies to all those of you who aren't considering yourselves soldiers, because that's not, the intent isn't to make you feel like we're not talking about you, because we are.
This one's for the panel, so it's going to be a touch on a few of your individual subjects. And just on that one note where we just finished off, it actually leads me to one of my points here, which comes down to identity and the identity that a soldier or a sailor feels during service. And my question for the civilian side of it is, how many of your people participating in the program are actually active members? And I would suggest, possibly without actually knowing the answer, that it's very few on the civilian side. Most of them are former members. Is that correct or not? Yes, for the civilian side of your programs, whether it's VHA or the transition program.
Yeah, the majority are already out, but we do have. So if you take a typical group of 6 to 8 people, we nowadays have between 2 and 3 people still in, either waiting their medical release. You know, they're on a temporary category and they're waiting for that. They know it's coming. They're planning, they're trying to get out. And other people, you know, one of the issues that always comes up is full-time versus regular force. There's some people who, you know, they did their full-time regular force tours and then they transitioned out into this, you know, the reserves. And so they're technically in, but they're also looking at other sort of career options as being a reservist now looking into the civilian world. So there is sort of they're still in and they're serving as a reservist and they're looking at their transition into other parts of civilian life as well.
Okay, and I would suggest possibly that the avoidance issue that we talked about earlier, which often leads to a member's release later on, whether it's for his own reasons, voluntarily release or otherwise, medical release, things like that, can often lead to a loss of identity, which could possibly contribute further. So I think the process in the system from the beginning, not necessarily.
Well, and I can speak to that. I spoke with the ombudsman who came through looking at the issue of transition several years ago. Identity is a huge piece for a lot of the guys, and I say guys. I have worked with some.
Yeah, I was going to say it's not just the guys, is it, Tim?
No, but for the people that we work with, as I said, we've run one mixed gender group with one person who wasn't a guy. So right now the decision's been made. We're just going to do gender specific groups, which is why we keep saying we need to have women's veterans groups. The identity piece is huge because when they come out, and some of the research I've done in terms of surveying veterans is that they said, you know, if the civilian world understood a little bit more about who we were, what we did, and what we stood for in the military way of life, our transition would be so much easier. And I think that's something that we as a community have to bear responsibility for. I loved what Rakesh said, that it's the democratic, representative democratic government that chooses the war. So we send them through the democratic process, and we have to receive them back. The identity piece is what oftentimes they get back when they come in, because so many of them have been isolated. They go into sort of 4 corners of the world, and sometimes it's the first time in years, or since they've come off tour, they've been in room with military people, because they didn't want to have anything to do with that. But that really it caused them to suffer a lot. And when they get that piece of their identity back, they can then move on.
My name's Helena Davison, and I'm a PTSD survivor and a writer. And I'm enjoying this very much today, this forum. I'm getting a lot out of it. Here's my question to anyone on the panel that wants to answer. I was in a PTSD recovery program at Homewood in Guelph. And in the group therapy sessions, they had the war vets in the same group with women who were survivors of rape victims, and domestic violence. What do you think of that?
You go first, I can comment.
Well, I heard that complaint before, that concern, and to the best of my knowledge, I thought that there was supposed to be a division coming through in order to separate that. But I'm not sure. Sorry?
How long ago was it?
This was 2 years ago, and they did have a separate section for war vets, but they had the option of being in with civilian groups, which were mostly women who were victims of rape and violence.
I think you're making a very good point. It would be very, very inappropriate, I would think, to have certain groups together.
Thank you, because the experience was traumatizing.
Yeah. No, I've heard that before.
Yes.
This is not unusual.
I would just add to that to try to keep open the notion that there are veterans and then there are sexual assault survivors, because there are veterans who are sexual assault survivors, male, female, and I think it's really about what is the group trying to do. If it's a psychoed group about informing people about trauma, symptoms, those kinds of things, you know, anybody can show up. But if you're actually getting into treatment where you're looking at past experiences, I think there has to be some sort of common experience that will bind the group. That's my preference. So whether it becomes civilian, military, or anything like that, I think it's for sexual assault groups, especially, and again, oftentimes women can be sexually assaulted by their mothers as children. So there's sometimes this false dichotomy is that, you know, women are, and a large majority of the sexual assault happens by men against women that we know of. So I think having gender-specific groups for those kinds of things sometimes can prevent some of the problems that you may have experienced. And it's more of a clinical piece around what's the purpose of the group rather than trauma writ large. You know, as PTSD, so everyone who's got PTSD is the same, which is not the case.
I think you raise an excellent point. The whole idea is the homogeneous group versus the heterogeneous group, right? And that's sort of big theories about sort of group processes. I think that even if you have a group of military members that are together, there still will be some heterogeneity, right? Some of them are going to have childhood adverse experiences, Navy versus Army versus Air Force, you know, those kinds of things. But there'll be more commonality than differences, right? And one of the really important points, if you read, you know, Colonel Retired Hogue, some of his stuff coming out of the States is that for good reason, you know, the victims of, you know, sexual assault, crime, it's a victim, sort of a model victim, survivor, those kinds of things. And the more we like to think about with the military members, with the soldiers, sailors, airmen, is it's more of a reaction to the extreme traumas that they go into. So it's a little bit of a difference in paradigm as well, in language shift, and you'll find a little bit of difference in that way, in the way that, you know, the whole tone will be kind of different. So I would support sort of, certainly that's an intro. I'll talk to the folks in Homewood next time I get a chance. I didn't think it was still going on, but, you know, I think having people that different probably isn't helpful. Although we we have the risk in our own groups of, yeah, but you know, you were inside the wire, I was outside the wire. You were in Mirage, you were on a ship, that's not the same. You were in Croatia, I was there. You were in Somalia. So we do have that even within our own so-called homogeneous military groups as well. And one of the interesting difficulties in trauma group work, and I commend anybody that does it and does it well, is how you contain that sort of almost narcissistic individual, mine was worse than yours, and how we can get that common ground of suffering is suffering and we've all experienced. And I think that's, so in some ways the heterogeneous group helps with that, in the sense that we can acknowledge that what that guy or gal went through in the Persian Gulf is very traumatic, just like what I went through in, you know, in Kandahar, that type of thing. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
I can speak to how we do that at the BTP.
Sure.
Just how do we prevent that? In terms of what Rakesh is saying around how do you prevent that kind of thing of, well, mine is worse than yours, or yours isn't as bad as mine, et cetera, et cetera. One of the screening criteria to getting in is you have to be willing and able to support other people in their work. And it's just laid out. If you're not willing to do this, if you're unable for whatever reason to do it, you're not allowed in yet. And I say yet because it might just not be the right time. So before people come into that group, they've already said, I'm willing and I'm able to do this for other people. So if it doesn't happen, we as leaders have ways to go back and say, I'm confused. You told me you were willing and able to do this. I'm not seeing that. What's going on? How do we deal with it now? So there are ways to do that, and you can't screen everything out, but that is one of the requirements for getting into the group. You can't come into the group if you're not willing and able. I make that distinction. Some people are willing and not able. Some people are able, not willing. Some people are both. So I think it's really to the point in terms of facilitating groups, because groups can be really good or really bad.
I've got 4 more questions in the queue, Dave.
When I started out on UN missions and truce commissions, the military in its wisdom decided that we were going to go to some countries that had some weird and wonderful diseases. And the inoculations that we got, left arm, right cheek, left cheek, and I don't know how many shots we would get, and then we would go off to whatever country we went. Hopefully we wouldn't get some of these terrible diseases. And one of them was malaria. And usually when we're in scene or on the mission, then we would have to take these different tablets for malaria. And some of us, we found that it was quite a result of the medication. We just couldn't do it. And the problem was, if you didn't take your medication, then you were charged and you went up before the CO and you got some degree of punishment for not taking this medication. I look around the room and there's many here that would realize that when the senior NCO found out that you weren't taking the medication, often there was a choice. You either take the charge and go up before the CO and take the punishment there, or you take the senior NCO's punishment, and he did his dirty duties for the next 6 months, and it was never recorded. And that, the unfortunate consequences of that now, as I understand it, some of these medications that we took now mirrors PTSD, and yeah, and that's the question I'd like to ask about that. And the unfortunate thing is, a lot of us, if that is fact what's happened, we cannot record it because we took the senior NCO's punishment.
Right off the headlines, CBC did a story yesterday. I mean, it wasn't really good journalism. I mean, we're just in the process of responding. I'm sort of, if you see me distracting, the minister's got questions about it. I mean, there are multiple medications for malaria, and the one thing that we have to realize is that malaria itself is still a dangerous disease that kills people and could affect a military, not operational. So with all treatments, there's side effects, and there's that. We took malaria in Rwanda when we went in '93, and I think at that point it was still special release, and what had happened is a lot of the good old drugs, partly because of the Vietnam War, mosquitoes have become resistant to them, right? So there's a few medications that work, Lariam or mefloquine, the one that's been taken, and almost everybody that goes on a holiday in Vietnam and Cambodia actually takes it and has been taking it for 20 years. The advantage is it's a once-a-week thing. Side effects can include things like, vivid dreams. I remember having some vivid dreams, and I'll share mine over a beer sometime, but not in a public forum. But it was actually quite pleasant. But it could also be nightmares. It could also be nightmares, and so you have these things, and so what ends up happening is that one of the biggest challenges in medicine, in military medicine, and if you remember my slide of the public, of how the interaction with the whole thing, is war syndromes. Okay, so we have historically, for hundreds and hundreds of years, made the kind of comments like, I went there, there was soil there, there was depleted uranium there. Now I'm 10 years later, I've got cancer. It has to be from that, or it has to be. So that's the causal link. And the risk of the causal link, there's an association, and you make a causal link, then you make an attribution, right? And that becomes very difficult. So Health Canada has approved the drug. There's indications for the medication. We in the Public Health Agency track these things very carefully. There's controversy now created by the media about it, and I think what happens is that every time, and this isn't really the Director of Mental Health responsibility, it's still part of Surgeon General's shop, but it's the Force Health Protection, and we monitor. So in Afghanistan, we were the only country that was trapping mosquitoes on a regular basis on Kandahar airfield. For those of us that deployed, remember, if you were in the airfield, you weren't taking the mefloquine, but you were taking it if you were in the FOB. So we look to see where the mosquitoes are, and if we're trapping the mosquitoes, they don't have the malaria. So the key ends up being is, the unfair comparison is, let's compare mefloquine to nothing, but we have to compare taking mefloquine to the risk of getting malaria, which is a very serious illness. In terms of, and the challenge that ends up happening, and to some extent the MTBI is a controversy as well, is somebody's been to Rwanda, they've been knee-deep in body parts, they've been digging mass graves, they've been, people have been dying all around them. Afterwards they have nightmares, flashbacks, classic PTSD symptoms, and oh yeah, I took mefloquine too. I mean, how are we going to tease that apart? Right? I mean, like really in that sense. So if we had people that took mefloquine and were not exposed to trauma, and suddenly develop PTSD, I think that would be interesting. But that's not the case. It's a very difficult thing to tease. I think that nobody in the forces, I mean, because we're members ourselves, we go and we take the pills ourselves. So there isn't anything that doesn't undergo the scientific scrutiny. And I think, you know, we've had the controversies about multiple vaccines over times, and there's people in society that opt out of giving their kids certain vaccines. But because of vaccines, we hardly as doctors don't see mumps and measles anymore, right? I mean, if you saw one in a children's hospital now, all of the doctors would come and see it. So part of it becomes, yeah, we all take a little bit of risk with certain things like vaccines to have the whole herd sort of protected.
And fair to say, Rakesh, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not why you got it, it's what symptoms you have now, and if they're PTSD
well, that's it.
or
and,
you
and
have.
so that's right.
And
we're going
we'll
to
take care of that.
We're going to address them head on, and you know, so that's the key.
Morning, it's Greg Passy.
Yeah, hi, Greg.
Rakesh and I go back about 2 decades.
We almost got a Rwanda anniversary.
I was thinking we're coming up to the Rwanda anniversary. There was 2 things. I wanted just to address the lady's comment about the group therapy, trauma therapy. It's actually, if you can combine people from a variety of traumatic events, and they're able to form a group, it can be actually very healing. And back in the early 2000s with Vancouver General Hospital, we were running a PTSD program there. And I had, for instance, in one group, a UN peacekeeper who had to kill somebody. I had somebody out of Rwanda whose family was killed, actually was Burundi, whose family was killed by soldiers. I had a police officer that had to shoot somebody. I had a number of women who had been physically and sexually assaulted. I had a person in there that was actually an abuser who became a victim themselves. And the way we did this is we spent a lot of time on individual therapy first to prepare the person. You cannot take people into a group without them being prepared and having done the individual work. And those people that said they could never be with that person, they would be too triggered to be in the room with such a person. By the 8th session, they were coalesced into a group because the commonality was the PTSD symptomatology and the fact that they could no longer function in their personal lives and their professional lives. So in general, I absolutely agree. You cannot mix, but if you do it properly, it is very much a healing process.
So there's risk involved. But with Homewood's model, flying people in.
That way I totally disagree with. Totally disagree.
I'll let you catch
Yeah,
up.
and let me just ask a question. Again, Tim and I, we go back a fair piece because I was with Marv when he first started to put the program together. And I'd really like to commend the program. It brings veterans out of their isolation, their avoidance, allows them to start trusting again and get support as well as provide support. The one concern I have is there's a misperception, particularly among the veteran population, that it's a PTSD treatment program.
And the politicians.
And the politicians. And I see your program as a tool in the recovery process, and I think it's a very important tool. The one comment I wanted to make, though, is you, with your stats, because there's, as you say, you accept people without a diagnosis, there's stats there as far as improvement in depression and trauma symptoms and stuff. But when you stated your goals, I'm not seeing that you've got measurements of your goal outcomes. And so there's a bit of a disconnect on that piece. I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's a good point. You know, part of the responding to sort of this call for scientific legitimization of treatment programs. We've talked, use the p-values. You've got the standard deviations and all that kind of stuff, so that people can trust that yes, this really is going to be a treatment that's going to address these things. Some of the call was for, well, what does it do with depression? How does it deal with trauma? What's your data, right? What's the data? So those particular stats were in response to requests for more data about these things. In terms of the goals, and I don't mean to be sort of facetious here, but we don't have a standardized measure for dropping baggage quite yet. we don't really have a standardized measure for like feeling less isolated and more like a military guy who doesn't feel ashamed of what he did yet. It's a bit of the, I see the interaction between the systems that support and will fund these things, the requirements which are oftentimes insurance-based about cost recovery and preventing liability, oftentimes then dictate what's allowed to be delivered. You know, when I teach my students at the school, I say, like, there's loads of data on CBT, and CBT is imminently researchable. More complex ones are harder to research in the way that you need to say, here's your control group, here's what happens. It's not that it can't be. It's delivered at UBC. They're right now, with some funding again from the Legion Foundation, are starting to establish the research protocols to start to look at more of those sort of control designs. You know, take the people who are going through the 10-day residential of the VTP as take a control group, get the measures set up for everybody. One of the things that we've stopped doing is trying to convince people. It's been 14 years. We're not really interested in convincing anybody outside of what's happening, whether or not it works. And we actually don't receive many formal referrals. Almost all the referrals for 14 years have come from some guy who went through the program and said it helped him and told somebody else. That's, I think, also part of the reason why we have such high completion rates. That we do accept referrals from everybody, but the questions always come, well, where are your stats, where are your numbers? And having been through 14 years of providing numbers and then asking more numbers and giving bar graphs and wanting more bar graphs or different bar graphs, we've kind of just said, okay, we're just going to keep doing our thing here. But it's a valid question from a scientific, when I put my researcher hat on, it's a completely valid question. You have to do this if you want to have people say, yes, this really does work. So it's a totally valid question.
Thanks, Tim. Next questioner is someone who's traveled a fair bit from Bellingham, Laurie Fuston, and she's here because she lost a son to PTSD through suicide. So, Laurie, you had a question.
This was for Colonel Jetley. I can't begin to tell you how I commend you for the amount of time and effort that you've put into this study. It's right on. The one thing, and I know I'm going to get the fastest answer because I'm the last one before lunch.
Oh, you and I can continue.
I did lose my son through suicide. I have come to realize, and what I saw and what I see in a lot of the veterans returning, when you look past the actions, the emotions, I see intense pain. With my son, I watched him die like a cancer, slowly sucking the life out of him. To me, I recognize suicide as becoming a tool to cut the emotional pain. It wasn't that it was an enemy. It was that it was a tool that was used to cut pain. And forgive me if I'm taboo for mentioning the word. Forgive me. Don't swear at me. But I did see up there the word suicide. But and of course, as you well know, we are epidemic down in the States. But like you, I am trying through what's going on down in Bellingham to bring a community together, because if it isn't the community who becomes a part of this healing, I believe we're going to lose thousands more. For the ones that do fall through the cracks, I don't want to believe that my son was a very small percentage that was lost through suicide. So anyway, and again, I'm grateful. War in the Mind did not do you justice.
No, I don't. Very sorry for your loss. I mean, I think, within Canada, within the Canadian Forces, we do freely discuss mental illness. We discuss suicide. We discuss it at every level within chain of command. That's been a real commitment, and I'm in regular communication with my colleagues in the States, and I know everything that's being done. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, one way of thinking about it is it's the ultimate avoidance, right? I mean, so if we look at it that way, but it really does take a community. It takes a community. When we talk about the divisional system of the Navy, we talk about the regimental system of the military, but we also talk about towns and communities, because we're sending our young people over there. We come back and we feel this sort of guilt, and health professionals can do so much, and I was testifying once at a parliamentary, sort of like a congressional hearing kind of thing, but a parliamentary thing in Canada, and a very aggressive MP was talking about, a suicide that had occurred and blah, blah, blah. And my colleague, was actually Steph Granier, was next to me, you know, and he's a founder of the OSISS sort of organization. He sort of stopped and started answering, and he says, you know, like, do you think that it's always the doctor's fault? He's saying, well, let me tell you my story. You know, on Tuesday, I said goodbye to my doctor, thanks for the session. And then on Saturday, my wife found me in the basement trying to kill myself, right? And so what ends up happening is that, you know, while absolutely the health professionals will do our absolute best, and you know, I think that, you know, there's a part that we play in assessment, in treatment, and all of this. But when the rest of the world has the people for, you know, the remaining hours and days and weeks between sessions, we all need to sort of help, and we have to help each other and you know, get people the care they need. And I think peer support helps, because if they're struggling with coming to healthcare, then seeing a peer sort of saying, hey, you know, I've been there too, but there is hope. You know, I think the ultimate avoidance is one thing, but I think if we give people hope, if they can see sort of beyond the darkness, you know, and the fact that, you know, no matter how dark it gets, the next morning the sun always rises. If we can get people that little bit of hope, which people like you will do more than I will do, then let's get them into care. Let's get them some help, and you know, sons like yours won't have died in vain if we can keep sort of moving forward with this.
Thanks, Rakesh. And we'll close out with one last question. I know there'll be some follow-up interfacing during the lunch hour, so I'll leave that. But Roxanne, you had...
I'm Captain Roxanne Reese, retired from the military 15 years ago. I have several people on watching video streaming. I've been texting back and forth, and I've asked every one of those people who are suffering from PTSD, I can't even say it, how many of them have heard of the Veterans Transition Program? Not one of them has heard of it. They would all be a very likely candidate for it. And if the only way they hear about it is word of mouth, I suggest you please start talking about it. You raised a very interesting point about isolation. All of these people feel very isolated. I have traveled across the country 3 times, digging people out from under places like the Johnson Street Bridge, because I know they're not getting the help they deserve. They're not getting the help they deserve because there is no rehabilitation, and don't you dare tell me that CISIB is a rehabilitation program. Don't you dare. Because that only deals with broken limbs and things. It does not deal with what these people are suffering with. They're all likely candidates for your program. They've now got your email address. Some of them are women, including me. I'll be on you.
I think we're touching on capacity, not will or effort, and we'll talk a bit more about that this afternoon, to be sure, in the close-up session. So, folks, we'll wrap up the panel now. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for stepping up and telling your tale.